All right. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
How's your icon been
Pretty good so far.
on day one?
Yeah, day one.
First full
still
day?
feeling fresh.
Always a lot of initial energy and activity, right? And so you kind of gotta regulate and go, okay, tomorrow, maybe we'll take it a little bit easier, stuff like that. So, yeah.
Definitely. So how does storytelling enhance the donor experience?
Well, kind of the way that Abby and I frickin' frack each other, I would say, play off each other is I like to think about the data side, and Abby's more about the mechanics of telling the story and the actual depth of that. And so I'll kind of answer that from the data side and then maybe hand that on over to you, right? When we look at what drives interest in a mission, there's three motivations for people. It's either that they were asked or the situation demanded that it's of interest to them, right? It's Giving Tuesday, or there's an emergency, give. But that goes away. There's a story there, but it's not one that's gonna stick with the people. Then there's relationships, and the story that might get told there is like, hey, we have a great relationship and I'm doing this thing. I hope that you can help do this thing. But that person leaves, you lost everything. Data shows that the strongest form is identity-based motivation, something that resonates with the person. So what's interesting is the evolution of how people think about the hero of the story. I've had a lot of conversations even at Icon here about the donor's journey and the hero's journey. And I think we need to even start to interrogate that, because there's some things that we even found in our recurring giving report that we'll touch on, that really imply that people are there not because they're excited to be the hero, but that something is happening through their agency. So there's more that we can unpack the data-wise, but what are your thoughts?
So Tim is the data person. I tend to be the human person, in that when I think about stories, I know that the data backs up the importance of it. But the thing that always strikes me is just that storytelling is the most innately human thing you can do. We've been telling stories since the dawn of man. And I like that you referenced the donor's journey, because the literature person in me knows the cycle, the narrative cycle that shows up in all the stories. There's not necessarily always a hero, but someone does always step in to a situation. And because of that, because of the narratives we're also familiar with, because of the very human act of storytelling, we respond emotionally to stories. And we know that emotions are largely what drive people to support the causes that they love. It also helps us remember things. Anyone that sat through a math class can tell you that you don't remember a statistic, you don't remember a formula, you don't remember the answer to a question, but people will remember the way you make them feel. And if you share a statistic in an appeal, or if a donor knows their gift fed 100 people, that's wonderful. But what they'll remember isn't the number of people they fed. What they'll remember is the feeling they got when that happened, when they helped solve a problem. So I think when you're telling a story, you're tapping into someone's emotions and their identity, but you're tapping into something deeply human, and that people remember that. And if you want to build a relationship with a donor, which is we all know is necessary, it's an indispensable part of that relationship.
I'm probably violating the rules here, but can I ask you a question? Is there always a conflict? Do stories that nonprofits tell always have to have conflict?
Really putting me on the spot here, because I'm trying to think of an instance where there's not conflict.
And it's also, how do we define conflict as well?
And that's the big thing. So
does it always have to be, it doesn't always have to be urgency though.
Right, it doesn't have to be urgency. So I have a background in literature, and you always hear in the narrative structure, there's always conflict. It's man versus God, man versus nature, man versus man versus...
This is why I'm asking you that question.
So yes, I cannot think of an instance that I've seen an effective nonprofit story where there hasn't been a conflict. The most effective nonprofit stories that I have seen invite the reader to be part of the group that is solving the conflict. And it doesn't have to be urgent, and it doesn't have to be a huge conflict, and it doesn't have to be even what we would necessarily consider a conflict. Solving a problem is a conflict.
Well, and even going back to my answer before about identity-centric and things of that nature, I was talking earlier with about this very topic of donor hero elements of that, and it was interesting because Rhea Wong, really great consultant in the sector, awesome book, Get That Money, Honey, great book, right? But she even said, I'm going to push back on they don't want to be the hero because it's actually more that they want to be part of that bigger group. And I think that's what gets missed, is that we miss that third element where we can focus on the personalization, right? It's like, oh, I've made this personal because I used the merge tags and I used their first name, or I brought up a thing that might be interesting to them. And people also want to feel that like they weren't guilted into stuff, right? Like that's bad storytelling, in my opinion, is one that like leans on shame, leans on guilt. Like, how dare you not give this, or the cat will die, you know, that type of thing. But it's that third component that makes it hard to balance. This is both an individual action, but is part of the collective. And I think that's where it gets hard with storytelling in this case, because in other situations, people don't necessarily have to take that into account. I don't know, maybe they do. You know, that's my thought though, but.
I can't open that proverbial can of worms because I have a lot of feelings about the difference between making the donor the hero and making them heroic for being part of a collective group of people. That's something that I will keep you here all afternoon talking about. But,
Yeah. No, definitely. And yeah, something we're always going back and forth.
Yeah.
The tennis match.
Yep.
What role should donor feedback play in shaping nonprofit stories?
I will give the caveat that asking individual groups of people for their opinions on a story is a dangerous move, because everyone has opinions and you can never make everyone happy all the time. So if you're a fundraiser and you poll your donors and ask their opinion about the story you're telling, you're going to have your feelings hurt and you will be paralyzed by indecision because you will not do anything that will make everyone happy. Instead, what I would do is look at what stories have worked in the past and elicited a positive response and compare those to each other and see what common denominators you can identify, or talk to individual donors who have been engaged with your organization for a long time and are committed to the cause and are engaged in your community and maybe your work, and ask them what stories they're looking for, what stories move them, because they are your perfect supporter. And their feedback will be much more constructive than asking 150 people what they like, because the latter is a mess.
I think the next advent in making data actionable as it relates to storytelling is better understanding motivation. And at the same time, you can collect this type of information in various ways. It could be a simple thing like adding something onto your forms that ask, like, what motivated you to give today? Now you can have debates on, do you pre-select those for people versus open text fields and things like that? But when you're soliciting feedback, when you're soliciting that type of stuff, it's ultimately coming down to relevancy. Are you designing something that's relevant to the audience? And can you make adjustments in your storytelling, your strategy, your process to maybe make that more relevant to the audience? But
what do you think about eliciting donor feedback through surveys?
And well, this is kind of where I was going with it, because I think that donor surveys, one, it's interesting because I don't think they get used enough, but then at the same time, when they do in its current form, they're very self-serving. And it's weirdly, it's hard to not design things that are self-serving. Let's put it that way. It's actually very, like, that's the default state, because we're we have a lot of things going on. When you're designing for feedback, surveys are a great mechanism to start. I think what people also can start to layer in is more dedicated focus group discussions as well that build on top of that. Consider the survey your first layer of prioritization. And then you can start to go, okay, let me select a few archetypical voices to work through the more deeper nuances here. People forget that focus groups exist as like a stop along a journey, right? It's to focus an element around a certain thing, right? So you can do that. I think surveys are great. I think that they can get used more, but we always have to design for our audience. And if you just throw things out there and hope what I'm trying to say is it can be very easy to get into survey bias to validate a thing you already want to do. And that can be very dangerous when it comes to storytelling in particular.
Okay, that's fair.
I think they're great, but I think we need to reevaluate how we design them as well. Mina Das talks about this really, really well. I know she's going to be one of the guests as part of this too. So big fan, but I think we can rethink how they're used too. And interviews are great too.
Yeah, how do you engage the donor's own inspirational stories in stewardship? How do you engage that?
I mean, what have you seen in your time where the donor story gets folded in potentially as part of the main narrative? Maybe I'll ask it that way. What's a good way that comes true? Versus here's this rich person and we put their weird interview up.
I mean, I can see that happening when it's a social proof. It's really invaluable. Yeah. But the other area I see that being extremely useful is in organizations that have missions or serve communities that need to be protected. When I've talked about storytelling in the past, or even when I talk about the significance of using imagery in your stories, I hear a lot from health organizations and organizations that serve domestic violence victims and all kinds of missions that they have to be very protective of their clients. They can't tell their stories safely. Donor stories can be an invaluable way to reiterate to people the impact they can make to elicit an emotional response in them that deepens their relationship with that cause in a way that doesn't endanger the community they're serving. So I think for those groups, it's particularly valuable. And then I think especially if you have a donor who's willing to give, testimonials, and I hate that word because it makes me think of marketing.
Yeah.
I know is a dirty word sometimes, but it's a social proof. And it also is nice to switch it up sometimes.
I think we when we were doing our recurring giving report, my favorite chapter was the donor behavior chapter because we looked at the textual analysis of what people were thinking when they gave. And to add to Abby's point, it was very evident that people really were strongly driven when there was a lived experience that they either went through or someone that they know went through. And that type of story is the one where if you're seeing that note come in, and for instance, LGBTQ organizations, stories of coming out, and somebody said, I wish I had a nonprofit like yours when I was going through this. That is a donor story that needs to go, let's talk about that, because it does two things. It shows that you're inclusive of people that have gone through the thing that you're doing, and two, it might remove the sensitivity because they've been through the experience, they've gone through that, they've actually felt comfortable enough with you to share that in a digital format already, and so you can flag that and go, I think I want to interview this person. And then that is almost the best of both worlds because it hits all three of those things. They don't feel shame. In fact, they feel pride for giving because you exist, because you're there, because you were there for something that they wish you were there when they lived through it. they also then feel part of that larger collective.
Yeah.
And there is absolute like joy in being asked to tell your story in that situation. So I think that's there's so many underlying things in that chapter alone that will change a lot of people's perspectives on storytelling in particular. I think that long-held validations on how we think about the donor are not going to get challenged. They're going to get more nuanced and deeper for the average fundraiser. I think these are things that people who have well-resourced nonprofits have known for a very long time. What we're going to start to see is that accessibility and insight. Everybody has the ability to tap into that.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about the recurring giving report.
Well,
tell it, and anything in there that, you know, storytellers, marketers, is there insights in it that can really help guide the way we tell stories?
Well, Abby heads up our research at Neon One. So why don't you give a little bit of color here, and then maybe I can talk about the data.
Definitely. So I think there are useful bits in there. So it's kind of in two sections, like benchmarks and trends, and then donor insights. I think the donor insights will be especially useful. One of the things that I loved, and Tim alluded to it a minute ago, we had something like 12% of recurring donations that were initiated had notes that accompanied them. It wound up being 13,000
About that, yeah.
notes. And when we did an analysis of it, we started looking for patterns in what people told the nonprofits they were supporting when they made those gifts. And the identity markers that showed up and the emotional responses that showed up over and over and over again, I think are going to be really useful. I've seen a lot of reluctance, just around storytelling in general. I had someone tell me that they felt like they were manipulating people when they were trying to elicit an emotional reaction by sharing a story. And I was like, no, that's what you want.
That's human connection.
That's human connection. Yeah. If you anyway, that's a whole.
This is not a dog crying on TV with Sarah McLachlan playing over it. It goes beyond that.
Yeah, and so we see like sentiments of inspiration and hope and pride, and we see identity markers that show up over and over again. People's sexual orientations, especially for those LGBTQ nonprofits.
Socioeconomic class.
Status.
Because people are people. And we've sometimes divorced that when we look at these industry reports and benchmarks and stuff like that. And we had to tell the fullness of the human experience here, because ultimately that is the generosity experience that goes beyond the donor's journey toward why should somebody trust the nonprofit. And we are finding that recurring giving is an amazing vehicle and a growth vehicle for that community-led growth, especially.
So look through that section and look at the emotions that elicit these responses and tell stories that prompt those emotions in other people. I promise you're not being manipulative. People give to things that they care about, and when people care about something, they get emotional about it.
Where can people find the report?
At neon1.com. It'll be on the homepage. So yeah, neon1.com, easy thing. You can find that there. It'll be on, prominent on the homepage, and it's quick download.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.